Hi, I'm Neil Nobel, editor-at-large of The Prickly Pear, and welcome to the Cactus Patch. Our guest today is Shaun Rieley, who is Associate Director for Programs and Development at the American Conservative. Shaun has a PhD in political philosophy from the Catholic University of the United States and has served, 9 years in the U.S. military, the United States Army, serving in Iraq and in Guantanamo Bay. Shaun, thank you for your service to your country, and thank you for joining us today. I really wanted Shaun today because there have been some things rattling around in my head that I need help with, and he's a specialist on the French Revolution. And the reason for that is I was arguing with a friend the other day, and we were talking about the fissures that are opening up in this country and how he thought it was similar to the period prior to the Civil War. And I thought about that, and I know enough about history to be a little bit dangerous, but not terribly informed. And I said, no, I don't think there was much difference in the way a person thought in Alabama or Pennsylvania. They thought differently on slavery and on the tariff, perhaps, but about the nature of the universe, I didn't think there was that much difference. And today, we're really seeing a division, a deep division on the nature of almost reality. We're having people tell us that there's no differences between men and women, that we can reimagine all kinds of institutions in society without consequences. We can do away with the police. We can do away with prisons. We can print money indefinitely and not have consequences. That if I actually believe I am Peter Pan, that I can now fly, and if you don't agree, you're a bigot. And I just find that these differences strike me more like the attempt to overturn society we saw in the French Revolution than the Civil War. Now, having said that long introduction, what is your view of the current situation? Do you see this similarly, or how do you take it?
Sure. Well, let me preface this by saying I'm a political theorist, not a historian. So let me say that, and let me also say I'm a student of, but not an expert in the French Revolution. So with those caveats out of the way,
okay,
I am a student, particularly of Alexis de Tocqueville, right? Who's the famous French political philosopher and statesman who came over to the United States in the 1830s and subsequently wrote a 2-volume large study of the American regime as he saw it. And what's interesting, I think, about Tocqueville in particular, it doesn't get enough attention, but he actually predicts that the United States could potentially have problems, right, in the coming years. And a large part of his project actually is to ask, what is the difference between the French Revolution and the American Revolution, such that one, did what it did, and the other did what it did. The outcomes were quite different. So Tocqueville is a very useful study here, because he was asking, I think, many of the same questions that we are now asking ourselves.
Yes.
And I agree with you. I think that we find ourselves in a political moment that is unlike virtually anything we've seen before in this country, but we have seen it before in the French Revolution. I think I totally agree with you that during the Civil War, one of the tragedies actually of the Civil War, I think, was that the assumptions were so close, and yet they were unable to sort of avoid war. They were far enough away that they were unable to avoid war. As Lincoln said, we cannot endure half slave and half free. It's significant. I don't want to downplay it. I don't want to downplay obviously those who were sort of defending slavery or even advocating for as a positive good, like people like Calhoun did, to be sure. But I think you're right. I often think of the tagline of the movie Gettysburg, if you remember that, back in the early 90s. I think it came out. I was a big Civil War buff when I was younger, watched the movie 100 times probably. The tagline on the theatrical release was something like, one country, one God, one people divided,
Right.
something like that, right? So I think about that. It's true, right? There was a similar, to your point, there was a similar understanding of God, a similar understanding of the human person, a tragic rift over the morality or the or maybe even and certainly over the sort of prudential question of slavery. But there was a lot in common. So I think you're exactly right there. The French Revolution is different. It's different because there is an actual attempt. It's what the philosopher Eric Voegelin called a metaphysical revolt. Unlike in the Civil War, where there were sort of shared metaphysical assumptions. I think that's what we're
Right.
trying to get at.
Yes.
What happens in the French Revolution is there is a rift, a metaphysical rift, to where there is an actual attempt to, in a Promethean way, right, remake reality as such. There's an assumption that we can sweep away history, we can sweep away human nature, or maybe better, there is no such thing as human nature to be swept away, right? And so everything is social.
It's socially constructed however we want to make it.
Precisely. So it does end in this very very again Promethean sort of attempt to make human beings into gods over ourselves, with the power of life and death, and with the power over ourselves and over each other, to where we can start at year zero, right? Disregarding history and begin again. And of course, this is what the first conservative, are some usually called Edmund Burke, saw as the problem in his reflections on the revolution in France, where he critiques it as a kind of a metaphysical revolt against reality itself, against God, human nature, being itself. He doesn't use those terms, right? But that's what he means.
Well, if we're right about that, what does that tell us about the period ahead? I mean, the French Revolution ended with a struggle between moderates and radicals, and became the revolution turned on itself, which usually happens at some point, and we wound up in a dictatorship. I certainly hope we're not headed in that direction, but it's pretty hard to have a metaphysical split on the level we're having it without winding up somewhere deep in trouble.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I mean, because Tocqueville's clear on this, actually. The last chapter, so he famously writes, Americans most know him for his book called Democracy in America. But later on, a couple of decades later, he wrote a book that he never completed, which he called The Ancien Regime and the Revolution, the old regime, the before regime and the revolution. Where he basically argues that actually there's a way in which the precursors of the revolution was sown in many of the political and policy moves of the regime prior, and that it actually could have been predictable for those who could have seen it, right? So he tries to kind of reconstruct it and show how some of the moves that were done presaged the revolution. And he also says at the end, he says, of course, the revolution had to, in retrospect, end with Napoleon, right? End with a dictator coming to the fore. And the reason for this is because essentially, when you strip away history, you don't start with nothing. What you do is you open the road for tyranny, right? And the reason why you do that is because it is history and nature that constrains the potential, the would-be tyrant, from sort of exerting endless will, right? So, but when you strip away history and nature as standards by which society needs to be governed, what you open the way for is, again, the possibility that you refound society rather on pure will, right? So whoever has the strongest will becomes the one who will rule. Plato sees this too, right? In Book 8 of the Republic, he talks about the declension of regimes, the one just prior to tyranny is democracy, by which he means a complete leveling, a completely egalitarian society, right? And so this actually is where Tocqueville, he again doesn't explicitly reference Plato, but he talks about the problems with this kind of leveling motion that gets done in the French Revolution. It becomes the precursor for the rise of the tyrant, because again, society becomes based on nothing but will.
How can this be properly resisted? Because it seems to me that just an observation, I've been at least an observer of conservative efforts for probably now close to 50 years.
Sure.
And the fact is, we appear to be losing. And I mean, losing across a broad swath of institutions, family, police, government. It's not just a partial failure. At the same time, we've had pretty good success at the polls. Sure. But of a complete failure in terms of keeping the culture.
Yeah.
So if we're headed towards a Jacobin moment in this country, what's the way to address that?
Well, yeah. So I think what all this portends is really a fight over anthropology, right? What is a human being? And given that assumption, what then should society kind of look like? If you answer that question in different ways, you'll come out with very different ideas of justice, very different ideas of proper institutions, et cetera. So we really are at that level. That is the level. And so I think the first thing to do to resist is realize that that's where we are. That is the level of debate, right? That's where the point of debate is. So while we can talk about and obviously should continue to engage in electoral politics, we have to realize that the problem is deeper. It's not simply a matter of electing the right person or persons anymore. That's going to be insufficient. First of all, we have to be more, or I should say, second of all, right? The first thing is realizing the problem. Second of all, we need to be more savvy about understanding the ways that institutions function, the role of institutions. What is the function of institutions? And in some sense, the role is to form human beings, right? So the first question is, what is a human being? And then secondly is, how do we create institutions and work within institutions in such a way that we can properly form human beings? So it's really at that level of thinking. I think someone who's I think done a really great job recently looking at this problem, thinking through this problem, is Yuval Levin in his book A Time to Build, where he really goes into this sort of the conservative disposition, the conservative understanding of human nature, and then how that plays out in institutional sort of structures, and the need to kind of rebuild them from the ground level in some sense. I mean, so there's a way in which, though. So what's this mean? This means, in some sense, if it's time to build, this means in some sense that conservatism isn't exactly about simply conserving things anymore, right? In some sense, it means we need to be proactively doing things rather than just resisting the undoing of things. And so tactically, that has a whole lot of different implications, which are hard to talk about at the kind of level of abstraction that we're at, basically because this requires prudence, right? It requires the virtue of prudence to assess a given situation in a given locality or a given political sphere or something like this, and see what the most important thing to do is there. So the formation of statesmen here, then that's where you get to the question of statesmanship. Essentially, what statesmanship is understanding these big problems, but then forming oneself or being formed by institutions such that you can address those problems. And that's why frankly, publications like the Prickly Pear there in Arizona matter, because it's important to talk about the national stuff, but you have to if you don't sort of apply it in the concrete and at the local level, it's not really ultimately going to matter that much. So I mean, to recap really quickly, three levels, right, of thinking. First of all is understanding what we think the human person is, right, and then understanding the implications of that. Second are the implications in terms of institutions, and then third, understanding how those institutions can apply to concrete particular problems in particular areas.
It seems to me that even the idea of liberty now is in play. I mean, liberty to me always meant free of constraint of government coercion. That doesn't mean that I was free of all coercion from family, from my little league coach,
sure,
from church or anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Today, we seem to have a sense of liberty that is become so personalized, sort of like, I'm free to do any damn thing I want to do, ingest anything, live any way that I want to. And we're really living now in a post-Christian world.
Right.
And, trying to get our ideas out on such a broad and huge subject when we're being blocked by all the major media corporations, universities, all the way down now to grade schools, which are largely hostile to conservative views. I mean, that is going to be one hell of a task. How do we get about that task?
Yeah. I think that, so recapturing, I mean, again, one hesitates to so part of the problem I was pointing to earlier is the need in my last answer was the sort of need to connect the intellectual conceptual to the concrete. I do think one of the problems of conservatism sometimes is the intellectualization, actually, contrary to our friends on the left who say that conservatives are stupid or something like this. Often the actual, in my estimation, part of the problem is that conservatives do tend to over intellectualize and think that the problems we face are sort of abstract, right? And I think that is one of the reasons why the left wins a lot, is because they understand the dynamics of power simply better than we do, how to really utilize it. But I do think that recapturing the concept of liberty that you touch on, the ancient sort of Judeo-Christian and even frankly Roman and Greek concept of liberty, that is not simply the freedom from restraint, right? The absence of restraint,
right,
but actually is a freedom for, it's sort of a positive vision of freedom. And you can see this, in the motto of an organization like Intercollegiate Studies Institute, good friends of ours at the American Conservative, great organization. Their motto is educating for liberty, right? So if liberty is simply the freedom of restraint, it's hard to understand how one would need to be educated for that, right? So deep in the kind of conservative approach to politics, but not just politics, but this deeper question of anthropology too, is the idea that the human person is at some basic level flawed, right? Fallen or something like this in the Christian tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, but is possible to be redeemed in some limited sense. So the tension that exists in conservatism is, how far can we redeem in the human person through things like education, institutions, constraint, things like that, for a richer sense of liberty, versus the kind of the implicate or the assumption on the left that shared by the French revolutionaries, right, that human beings and therefore human society are perfectible, right? It's not perfectible, but it can be. We can improve ourselves through things like education, and so essentially, we have to resist at the same time. Again, this sort of concept of liberty as pure lack of restraint, and on one hand, and on the other hand, the concept of the human person and society therefore as completely perfectible. The conservative disposition is paradoxical in this way, but I think the benefit of the conservative tradition is that it better represents reality because it contains this paradox at its heart, because reality in itself is paradoxical in this way, and has to hold this tension. If you go off on either side, right, and trying to resolve these tensions, that's when you get into problems, right? Because reality itself is extremely complex. The conservative disposition, people like Michael Oakeshott, philosophers like Michael Oakeshott, thinkers like Edmund Burke, they are always talking about the complexity of society beyond the ability of any single mind or system to capture it. So the conservative approach to the world is one essentially of gratitude, right? And this is an important point, actually. It's one of gratitude for what's gone before, right? Rather than sort of outrage at the things, gratitude for the things that have gone before and the things that continue to work for us, give us some semblance of order, give us some semblance of dignity, rather than outrage at the failings. Because in some sense, if you approach the world with gratitude, you don't have this impulse that the French revolutionaries had to wipe out everything. Instead, you approach the world by saying, what's working, what's not, how can we fix the things, and what are the limits of our being able to fix?
Well, so you and I are not guilty of what we've just observed, that is operating at a high philosophical level, which I think you have to at some point. You have to understand what you're dealing with.
Completely agree.
But I would agree with you that, we've got an array of think tanks that have been churning out wonderful stuff for 50 years, and we're not really moving the ball very well. And it's sort of like a position paper just ain't going to do it. We've had a lousy ground game.
Yeah.
So what does that ground game look like? What should conservatives be looking to do? Should they all be thinking about, by golly, it's time for me to step up and run for office for my local county board, or what?
Yeah, so I do think, and here at the American Conservative, of course, we bill ourselves as Main Street conservatives, and in favor of something called what we call Main Street conservatism, which is essentially the idea that conservatism begins on Main Street, right? What the businesses, the associations, the schools, and so forth at the local level, those are the things that matter most to most people. I do think that we in this country generally, on both sides, we're guilty of it, but of course conservatives shouldn't be as guilty of nationalizing everything, right? And so the obsessing over the president or obsessing over the Congress, these things matter. Let me be very clear. These things matter. We should care. We should be involved. But in terms of your everyday life, those things are mostly abstractions, right? The bill that's pending in Congress, or the executive order that is pending over here, or what have you, are really abstractions. The things that matter to most people most of the time rest at the local level, and part of it is these things are often not very sexy, right? They're not as interesting, right? It's sometimes it's as simple as, should we put a stop sign at this crossroads, right? Or should we, or where should we put the stoplight? Or how are we going to fund this bridge rebuild, or something like that? But again, these are things that really matter. And again, in terms of, this is how this concrete level is really how we improve people's lives. But second of all, and this is again where Tocqueville is useful, they also show us, they are educative for us as citizens. to get involved in these local uh, both political and civil associations they're kind of training, they're kind of education as a citizen, both to understand the possibilities, but also importantly the limits, right? So Tocqueville argues in the old regime of the revolution that one of the ways and one of the reasons that the French Revolution was able to take hold so quickly, the ideas, these that were sort of arcane philosophical ideas that were coming out of this group called what are called the philosophes, right? It's just French for philosophers, that dispersed throughout society very, very quickly. And one of the questions he poses is why? How did this happen? And his answer is essentially that the free institutions that had existed in the Middle Ages had been undermined by the centralization of power in the Ancien regime, right? Under the kings, the absolute kings, Louis the 14th, 15th, 16th, etc. And essentially what happens is that both the aristocracy and also the ordinary people had lost the practice of liberty. They had forgotten how to practice political liberty and to be engaged in politics. They'd forgotten the possibilities for coming together to solve problems together at the local level. And so when you have that forgetfulness, ideas and abstractions that like the philosophes put forth begin to seem plausible. You forget what the limitations are for politics, and you forget that anything isn't actually possible because there are always going to be resource limits, fiscal limits, hard-headed neighbor limits, right? Just dealing with the intractability of your neighbors in some sense. And so there's a way in which the practice of politics at this local level, and I'm using again that broadly there to include involvement in civil associations of all sorts, becomes very important for the education of citizens. And so, again, it's twofold. It's learning, it's being involved because we need to put forth our ideas, but it's also being involved because it's important for us as citizens to be educated, right, in this hands-on kind of way, so that we can understand the limits of politics.
Well, it seems to me a lot of conservatives should be thinking about running for their local school board.
Yeah.
There's not much we can do about Hollywood, but we can certainly do something at that level. Just in the interest of time, what does a director of programs and development for the American Conservative do?
Sure. So it's a role that essentially it's a twofold role, and so the American Conservative. First of all, let me start with the second part. Development, very simple, raising money. To do what we do, we've got to raise money. That's just part of the deal. So I go out and meet with individuals, and I ask them to support our work if they agree with it, if they like what we're doing, and they want to help us expand. Then on the program side, we use that money to fund both our magazine and our online website, of course, as well. But then we also have a number of programs that we operate. One that we've started up recently is called the Constitutional Fellows Program, and that's run in Washington, D.C., and it's in conjunction with the Catholic University of America, something called the Center for the Study of Statesmanship there. And essentially, it's a semester-long course, six sessions over the course of a semester. It's aimed at early and mid-career policy professionals, so many staffers on the Hill, but others from around Washington, D.C., with the idea of giving them the sort of basics of the philosophy behind the Constitution, and then learning how to apply that to the politics. Again, kind of as we talked about earlier, the need to understand the ideas, but then figure out how to cash them out, right, in terms of actual policy that can be implemented. So it's aimed again at policy professionals in DC that are likely to be influential in that way. Some other ones that we do, we operate different lectures, panel discussions, things like that around different topics. We have, for example, we recently co-hosted with ISI, Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which I mentioned earlier, at Patrick Henry College in Virginia, one with Rod Dreher, as well as Daniel Mahoney and Josh Mitchell from Georgetown University, and discussing essentially the meaning of identity politics and the challenge that it poses. And then last week, for just one more example, we hosted a panel discussion with Jim DeMint, Mark Meadows, Christopher Bedford of the Federalist, and that was on crony capitalism and the COVID, basically how COVID has enabled crony capitalism to be to take hold, and the problems with that, and sort of how can conservatives respond. So that's just a small sampling of the kind of things we do. So I always look for opportunities to do more, and of course we of course always need financial support to expand. So if any listeners are inclined,
I was just going to tee that up for you. If someone wants to help you, how would they go about doing that? You have an address that they could send to? Did we just crash?
Oh, I think we're back. Are you back? Are you there?
Yeah. If someone was to help you, how would they go about doing that?
Sure.
If someone was to give you help, that is the American Conservative and your programs help, how would they go about doing that?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, you can feel free to reach out to me. My email is srieley@theamericanconservative.com. You can, of course, visit our website. You can subscribe to the magazine. And then on there, if you're so inclined to support financially, which we always appreciate, you can donate right to the website. So.
Well, Shaun, I really appreciate your time. This has been a very interesting, and we're living in a very challenging period where we have to battle at the rather high level of ideas right now because our society is becoming unmoored.
That's right.
From its belief system. On the other hand, we need to have a practical ground game.
That's right.
And I'm a little bit worried because it seems like it's flipped from the 60s. In the 60s, the left was always inveighing against the establishment.
Right.
Well, the left today is the establishment. They hold all the cards in terms of the major communication systems in our society, from education through Hollywood, with the exception of maybe independent publications like yours and the Prickly Pear and talk radio. We don't have much of a voice left.
Yep. That's right. Yeah, that's why it's so crucial, to support the institutions that we have, look for opportunities to build new ones, and it's important to engage at the level of culture. I think there are some conservative magazines that still do this reasonably well. I think of things like magazines like First Things, Modern Age, right? They kind of include some poetry and things like that, because I do think that it's important to the conservative identity that we not sort of politicize everything, to the extent that we can help it, while also, again, being savvy about the nature of power. But I do think that one of the problems that we have is, from the left, this kind of constant pressure to politicize every aspect of life. You see it. Major League Baseball now even is being politicized, right? I mean, our national pastime, something we used to all be able to share, is now being politicized. So, I think one of the best ways to resist is to resist that politicization of everything, and read a novel, read some poetry, go to a baseball game, or what have you. You support your little league. Etc. These sorts of things, preserving space for things that are not political, I think is a crucial part of this, while also getting involved in politics at the local, state, and yes, national level. It's all needed. We have to be smart about this. We have to be builders now. We have to be willing to willing to come together around our institutions that we have and think about the institutions that we need.
Shaun, thanks so much for spending time with us. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thanks again.
All right. I'll stop the recording here.